On Monday, 538 members of the Electoral College convened across the country, and they officially certified Biden as the president-elect. However, things are not as rosy as they seem. There is definitely a schism that's growing. Because less than a week ago, 126 House Republicans and 18 states' attorneys generals supported asking the Supreme Court to nullify the election results in up to 4 battleground states. And the Supreme Court denied it, which is good news, but the anger isn't gone. And today on the Tonic Accord, Drew and I are just going to cover why Republicans are hanging on to this nightmare and what could be the next step for the party. Drew, how are you today? How's life treating you?
I'm good, man. I'm good. And, this comes a day after the Electoral College, officially, casted their votes for Joe Biden. It's official, man. I mean, he's the president-elect. There's no way around it. That's, like you said, the Supreme Court knocked down these court cases. So, in my view, it's like if I was a Republican strategist, right, I'm looking at now is, okay, how do we how do we win in 22? How do we get back House control in 22? How do we get a larger Senate majority or a Senate majority based on how the Georgia runoffs work out? How do we get back into control in 22 and then set ourselves up for success to take back the White House in 24? What's weird, though, is a lot of Republicans are not having this conversation, maybe behind closed doors, but publicly, there's a lot of them are still hanging on to this whole election fraud nonsense, or at least, almost just tipping their hat to Trump and maybe just not saying that Biden is president. And I think it's ridiculous. I think it's going to be hurtful and for the future. Like, first of all, I think it's stupid, right? I think it's stupid to go down this route of election fraud when we've seen consistently that the litigation has proven nothing, and the cases were smacked down by the Supreme Court. So I think it's just stupid to go with anyway. But I think politically it's stupid because it it really makes you look like a sore loser. And what we're seeing now is this schism you're talking about, which is like, you have just this last weekend, you had Trump supporters at a pro-Trump rally yelling, "Destroy the GOP." We've heard them yelling things like "F Fox News," right? It's almost like this beast of this new right wing, this Trump wing, right? The Trump party is not loyal at all to Republican values, is not loyal at all to old Democratic norms or GOP establishment. They're not loyal at all to anything but Trump. And that's going to cause a problem when going forward, Trump will eventually be irrelevant. He will eventually be, he's pretty old, so in the next 10 years, he's likely to pass away. And in that time, his relevance is only going to go down and down. And so I think the GOP has a serious problem of making sure that these Trump voters stay Republicans. But right now, it looks like they're not. They're not staying Republicans, and they have no loyalty to the party.
Yeah, I think you nailed it there. What does this really tell us about the future of the party? Where literally Trump's messaging and his legal team's messaging has been, don't go to vote in Georgia because it's rigged. Like, to me, it's nuts. Like, it seems like Trump knows this and his legal team knows this and his base know this. And I don't really think they like the Republican Party.
No.
And I almost see that the fact that there's a lot of Georgia Republicans that are willing to not vote. Well, I mean, I don't know. We'll see how that turns out. But just the messaging is there. And the fact that people would do it means that I don't think a lot of Republicans are actually Republicans. I think they're Trumpists. And I think that schism is growing wider. And I just wanted to read you a quote that I thought was interesting, and I'm curious what you think. It's from, well, it was from an article in the Business Insider, but okay, here it goes. So we already have a massively compromised democracy, said Jason Stanley, a professor at Yale University, and he's the author of How Fascism Works. And he said, but had Republicans been successful in their long shot bid, this would have ended democracy. What do you think about that?
I think so, man. I think so. I think we were really close to losing, our democratic institutions because, um, I mean, in my opinion, the Republican Party has engaged in voter suppression for decades. that does not just include the ID law. I know a lot of people go to that and they argue the ridiculousness of it, but it does include like literally getting rid of polling places in black neighborhoods, fighting litigation to remove ballots that were cast by cars because of COVID. Right, like the Republican Party has often actively, and it's been noted how they actively go like voter suppression because it helps them win elections. And so it's just hypocritical for me to see them talk about how, we care about free and fair elections, right? This to me is the party that has engaged in trying to actively suppress democracy. And so I think it's ironic when they talk about like, a lot of Americans have lost trust in their faith in elections. Like, yeah, whose fault is that? Because my faith in my elections is not gone. I think it's people like got misinformation from Donald Trump, and now they don't believe the elections when they're perfectly safe. And so I think that like, and again, you still have to remember that we're looking at 60. I think I read from a Fox News poll that it was like 67% of Republicans believe that the election was stolen. 10% of Democrats believe the election was stolen. And I think it's overall like 35% of Americans believe the election was stolen. That's a third. That's 1 in 3 voters. That's insane. And so like so that statement about how, if Trump was able to actually clinch this out and like get 100,000 votes, removed from Pennsylvania, get 40,000 votes removed from Wisconsin or whatever, and was able to stop the count, then our democracy would have been completely compromised. Now, thankfully, he couldn't have done that, right? I think that I do think that a lot of this, like as we've seen play out, it's just dead air. It's nonsense. It's nonsense litigation, and it's played out exactly how a lot of people predicted, which was there is nothing Donald Trump can do to stop this election. The election is not. The millions and millions of people voting in this election is not a suggestion that then is just like stamped by a government official. It is the results. So all this nonsense about we're going to send our own electors to the Electoral College and, it has to be certified. Like, no, man, the people voted. That's who actually decides this, and it's done. It's been done.
I cannot agree more. I cannot agree more. I think you nailed it. And to me, like I think it's hard for some people to maybe grasp the severity of this moment, just because we've focused. I think like the Western focus on authoritarianism and fascism is kind of in the context of the beginning of the 20th century, right? Where it was this violent force of authoritarianism that came out, and this nationalistic state violence almost. But in the modern era, strongmen come to power through elections. They don't come to power through force. I mean, Putin, Orban in Hungary, people like this, they are elected, and then they erode the system once they're elected.
Yeah.
And that's why I do think that people maybe can't grasp sometimes the severity of what Trump has kind of done. And, it is nuts to me that 35% of the country actually think there's fraud, because quite frankly, there's a small percentage of people in every election that thinks there's fraud, right?
Sure.
Like, if you told me 5% of Americans or 10% of Americans think that Hillary won or Trump or Biden got it stolen or, whatever, I'd believe it. But 35%, that shows you that the temperature is rising. And I don't know, do you have that video I sent you? I think it was just kind of interesting because maybe just like a minute of it or something.
Well, it's 7 minutes long. Do you know which kind of part?
The beginning's good. I think it's just a congressman here who actually wrote a book on conspiracy theories. And so it's just kind of interesting. Just so maybe once he comes in.
Oh, once he comes into the interview or on the.
Yeah. Once he comes into the interview. So I'm pretty sure it's like pretty much right away. Yeah.
I got you.
Cool.
Few Republican lawmakers.
I think he just brings up some interesting
Joe
stuff.
Biden's victory. He is also
at least this does show, I think,
It's
that there are people inside the Republican Party, but they're few and limited. So
let's take a look.
Which focuses on the politics of conspiracy theories. You say you will not relent. You will do everything to stop the flow of disinformation. To that I say this morning, good luck.
Yeah, right.
Good luck with what we're seeing, Congressman. 106 of your colleagues have signed on to a lawsuit seeking to overturn the results of the presidential election. So you just promised not to relent. What's your message to them this morning?
What's going on is really what the question is, and I think it was the email, John, that I saw immediately. There was a couple things in there, and I actually read the emails that I get, and the first thing was that this might be your last chance to go on record, supporting what's happening as far as challenging the election. And the second one was the thing that I've seen more and more is that you're on a list. And I believe at this point, I would say this it's almost like a mythological meme that this stuff is just true and for a large portion of the population. But here's what I saw right after this happened, and I think this is what's going to surprise you, is the amount of fundraising that happened or piggybacked on this amicus brief. And, I saw it immediately from some of my colleagues who I really respect, but I was a bit shocked. And it's immediate. Stop the steal is still huge for some of these individuals. And I think this really was directed to those districts where a majority of the population in the Republican Party specifically might believe it. And that should disturb people.
Wow.
That's probably good. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's but like what this video kind of made me think about, and it's something that I don't really know what the correct answer is should the never Trumpers and let's say more the traditional establishment Republicans, the Romneys, this Riggleman, there was that guy, I forget his name, Mitchell, I think Paul Mitchell in Michigan, some of these people that are retiring, stepping down, leaving the Republican Party. And I kind of wonder, is it better for them to stay in the party or leave? Because if all the good ones and the reasonable ones leave, who's left? So I really struggle with, is it better for them to, like the never Trumpers, to start their own political activism outside of the party or to stay in? It's tough. I don't know. Well,
let me ask you, you're someone who used to identify as a Republican and recently you told me you're now an independent. Basically, why'd you make that change? What have you seen recently that led you to make that change? Because I fear there's a good amount of people that are probably going to feel the same way.
Yeah. I was wrong. I was extremely wrong. I thought that once Trump lost, the party would just kind of go back to a lot of their old ways. I thought that Trump energized the party, but Republicans were not going to die on that hill. But instead, I think what we've realized is 2020 and Trump have just been a culmination of failure by the Republican Party. And I don't think this party is ever going to be the same. Like I stand for big government in certain ways, but I prefer federalism, right? And
sure,
that was one of the main reasons why I, to a certain extent, have gone kind of back and forth. But as of lately, I just feel like the Republican Party doesn't really stand for anything from, what we've talked about in, voter suppression and now trying to literally throw out votes, and to the fact that they don't even support our allies. They seem to have a lot. This is blanket statements, obviously, but I just feel like they're morally bankrupt. And when your party gets to that point, I don't know if there's any going back. And now I do think, though, that like the Republican Party has kind of become somewhat of a populist movement, and I think that's the change we're seeing. And I don't really think laissez-faire conservative economics, which the party stood for decades, actually work. So I do understand why the party's changing, and maybe some of these people, rightfully so, should be cast out. Especially, I like Mitt Romney as a person, but I've never, quite frankly, understood the appeal of him as a politician. He is technically a self-made man, quite wealthy and successful, but he kind of resembles and stands for the same things that the Clintons did, the Bushes. Like, he's part of that establishment, and I do think that people were tired of that. And so I do think that there is some economic populism that could work, and Trump has maybe realized that inside of the party. But I'm just worried that instead of doing that, they're going to go more towards being the actual identitarians and the snowflakes. And that's what they've become, is not a populist party to actually help working people, which I could get behind, to be honest. But they've become a kind of almost like hyper religious, conspiratorial, cultist party. And that's dangerous for democracy, because you can't talk to those people. You're never going to convince those people of anything.
Yeah. Yes. I think you made a really interesting point, which was it's like the old Republican Party, the old GOP, but like the Bush style, the Romney, McCain style Republican Party is gone. And I think you probably have a good point of like maybe pivoting back to that won't work. I think you're right that the Republican voter now is way more economically populist than the neoconservatives and like you said, like the laissez-faire kind of conservatives of the past. So I wonder, is it possible to like move forward with Trump's like economic populism, anti-China, America first business strategy kind of thing, without without bringing along with it the baggage of racist dog whistling, conspiracy theories, right? Misinformation. Like, because, I can see a real strong Republican challenger being someone who's like, an America first, strong, a tough American figure who wants to take on China and bring back American jobs. I could see them actually swaying Democrats if they don't have this like white racist undertone of like save the suburbs, which has been a whistle, a dog whistle for racism against black people for a century, right? Like if you had a Republican that didn't have the ugliest parts of Trump, the tweets, the the Russia crap, right? All that stuff. If you had more of a economic populist Republican, maybe you can bring the party back together and convince like independents like yourself.
Yeah, no, and I totally agree with that. And that's kind of been what I've thought for a while. Like, I feel like the party is at kind of a crossroads right now. And they could either kind of go to the more conspiratorial dog whistling populists, which I think would borderline more as fascists over the long period. Or they could, yes, go to that more economic populism, like still sprinkling, conservative traditional values, the need for maybe progress to be slowed down at times. But unfortunately, I don't think that's where they're going again. Now, the interesting thing is, though, I actually do think that if all the minutia wasn't happening and all the false messaging from Trump's campaign, to be honest, I think there are potential crossovers between Trump's populist base and some of the things that Biden wants to do. Like, if it wasn't for the just BS politics that are being thrown around, there are things like Biden wants to be tougher on China. He wants to bring manufacturing back to the United States. He wants to look at infrastructure, things that would help average daily Americans. And, they want to work on advanced semiconductors being made inside of the US. That's something that Trump and Biden both want to do. And so I think this 4 years is going to be somewhat of a test on what happens next. I think if the Republicans just completely just go into almost a civil war of what I would call the cultists and the establishment folk, then we're going to have trouble, because I think the Senate's just going to be in chaos and Biden probably won't get anything done, but maybe he will if they're fragmented. Who knows? But I think that if we can see at least something happen that makes us work together and maybe some bipartisan stuff, then I do think that maybe there's a future for another politician. I don't know who that could be, because for a while I thought maybe a Tom Cotton, or I don't know, even like Tucker Carlson kind of has this similar message, but both of them are too far onto that dog whistling side. If they just need to find someone who almost has the brains of Tom Cotton without the craziness and kind of the speaking voice and image of Tucker Carlson. That's just my opinion.
I mean, I just think that, I really think that the Republicans are in a lose-lose situation, because I think that if they go full board, like let's embrace the whole Trump OANN conspiracy side, parlor social media only, like if they're really gonna go down the route of Fox News is too left wing, I don't think that's a winning strategy. Yeah, you'll get reelected in your congressional seat in Georgia, and that's why a lot of these congressional Republicans are doing it, because it works for them in their congressional seat. But I imagine if the Republican Party does that deal with the devil and continues to allows the Trump wing to infect their party past Trump himself, I think it will be a losing strategy in the long run. I think the Republicans it'll be very difficult to have a Republican president again. However, if the Republican Party makes the mistake of trying to revert back to the Romney-McCain era, which I would welcome personally, because it was more bipartisan, it was less based on racist dog whistling. I mean, still plethora of issues I had with the Republican Party of the past, but it's a very different thing. If they did that, though, then they risk, I think, losing this populist base and losing a lot of momentum. And like you said, I mean, you look at the rhetoric I'm hearing. I watched these rallies. I scroll through these forums of QAnon forums, Parler. I'm looking at it because I want to see what conservatives are saying. And a ton of them are saying things like, I voted for Brian Kemp in Georgia as governor because he would stand up for Trump and Trump standing up for him, and now he's letting him down. I will never vote for Brian Kemp or a Republican like him again. I mean, that's crazy. These are Georgia voters that have to vote in a Senate race in less than a month, in a few weeks, and they're saying I will never vote for a Republican again. I mean, that's got to be super intimidating for these conservatives. And I think it's a catch-22. I think if you go with the Trump wing, in the long term, you're not going to see a Republican president again. And I think if you go back to the old ways, you're going to lose your Trump wing, and you're going to have a hard time in these local races. It's real tough. Yeah. But I think a big litmus test is this Georgia Senate runoff. If both Republicans win it, and it's still very likely that that's the case, if both Republicans win it, then Mitch McConnell can take a deep breath, and he can be like, all right, Republicans can still win in local elections, right? We lost Georgia to Biden on the presidential scale, but Republicans still win in local elections. But if the Democrats take one of these Senate races, man, Republicans got to be shaking in their boots. They have barely a majority, if that. And they know now that the voting base in Georgia is shifting. Trump fans don't give a rat's ass about them. They only care about Trump, and you're going to start to see a real fracture that's greater than we're already seeing, I think. And that's why I think Representative Riggleman is so impassionate, because he and writes this book and talks publicly about it, because I think he sees it. I think he sees the Republican Party is screwed no matter which way down the road they go, and they put themselves there.
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest. I think the country right now, in a very, very conservative estimate, has four parties. You would kind of have the right-wing populist Trumpist party. Then you would kind of have more of the business establishment Republicans. Mm-hmm. Then you'd kind of have the centrist Democrats, the Bidens, the Clintons, the Obamas. And then you would kind of have the progressive wing. Like I think in the end of the day, like, yeah, I think you're right. I think the Republican Party's screwed. Like, I idealistically speaking would love to see an actual conservative populist come out of this who could actually do things for basically enact the promises that Trump never made or never kept. But that's not going to happen. And quite frankly, I think you're right, because I've seen some of these rallies, and the party is really in between a rock and a hard place. Like, Mike Lindell, I think that's his name, the My Pillow guy.
You're right.
Who I've heard he makes good pillows, by the way, but that's beside the point. But he basically talked about how the reckoning had already begun. Like, the crazy shit, excuse my language, that's coming out of some of these people's mouths is nuts. Like, he talked about how this election will be overturned. Alex Jones, who I sometimes listen to just because he's just ridiculous. I mean, he was talking about Biden is going to be replaced, whatever it takes or something like that, during that Million MAGA March or whatever it was called, which had a couple thousand people, I don't know. But yeah. And they need to tone down the rhetoric, because even if one or two people in that 30% of Americans who think Biden didn't win, if even just one of them does something crazy, these are those kind of black swan events that could cause something bigger, and that I am worried. Like, I think a lot of people thought, day after election, there's going to be chaos. And they're like, oh, well, we avoided it. We're in December and there really hasn't been that much chaos. I'm like, this is still in its infant stages of whatever's happening here. And the Republican Party is doing a disservice. And I like to kind of elaborate even more on why when you asked me like why I shifted parties, or not really shifted, but just left the Republican Party, is because at the end of the day, like, their rhetoric is dangerous. Like, that's the problem with it. And I like Ben Sasse a lot. He's probably one of the only Republicans I would really like stand behind right now, because he's not afraid of speaking in the open about Trump, but most Republicans aren't. And I don't care if you like Trump or are just afraid to speak out. That's compliance.
Yeah. I think that, and I think that the way you feel about it is how over time a majority of middle right Americans will feel about the Republican Party. Like, right now, it's really easy to get a bunch of retweets and fire up a base that has been misinformed and thinks the election is stolen. But the longer run about like political victories, like making sure that your party maintains the majority of public opinion, the Republican Party is not doing that. Right? There's no stimulus checks. There's no like these things that like, I see people on these like QAnon subreddits or whatever. I mean, the QAnon subreddits are like, people are going to the point of like, we need to take up arms. Like, this is a full-blown civil war. Like, so like you said, you have these individual moments that could be really potentially dangerous. Like, I mean, terroristic threats, right? I mean, we talked about people trying to kidnap the governor of Michigan. So yeah, that's just certainly a concern. But again, back to political strategy. I mean, 35% think the election was stolen, but that also means on the other flip side, 65% think it wasn't stolen, right? I do think that the Republicans are going to lose the majority of public opinion on their side if they embrace this Trump stuff much longer. It worked out for these 4 years, but dude, it's gone. Trump lost. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know why you beat a dead horse or stay on a sinking ship, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's a really good point you bring up. Is that over time we'll actually see how the sentiment in the Republican Party is, because I do think a lot of people are reactionary. Over time, there's a chance the Republican Party will just go back to kind of stagnating somewhere, bouncing between the populist and kind of the business side of it.
Sure.
And I do hope that's the case, not because I think that's where the party should go, but just for the sanity and safety of the country. And also, like, I think there is a, like, looking at that, what'd you say it was 35% of Americans or something like that? Right?
Yeah, around there.
Just because you think the election's stolen doesn't mean that you're going to do something or like really fight it. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Like, I feel like that number sometimes is overblown with a lot of, especially like people I've talked to that are more Democrat leaning. They think that means that, 35% of the nation would take up arms to overthrow Biden. No, they probably are asked and they say, well, Trump should have won. I'm more curious to see of that group how many actually would do something about it. Because I have a lot of conservative friends and they're like, yeah, Trump lost. I think there might have been foul play and I'm not happy, but Trump lost. And I know several Trump supporters in my own neighborhood and, they're not happy, but the signs are down and they're kind of moving on,
Yeah.
So sorry, go ahead.
Well, and I think that, and I think that's why this litmus test in Georgia is so important, because you have talk of Trump voters not voting for Republicans in Georgia because it's rigged or whatever. I think you're right that I think maybe it's probably blown out of proportion, where a lot of these Trump people will hoot and holler and yell at Brian Kemp for not backing Trump and should it overturn the results. But come January 5th, which is the runoff day, they probably still will get in line and vote for Kelly Loeffler and vote for, So we'll see. We'll have to see how this actually will affect the behavior of people at the voting booth. And the really only way to do that until 2022 is with this Georgia runoff. So I guess my argument is that this Georgia runoff is a big litmus test for the future of the Republican Party.
Absolutely agreed. And it's going to be really interesting because, I mean, the messaging on the right involving Georgia has not been great. I mean, Trump said vote on June 5th. They've said don't vote. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see, man, because I think in a normal election, Georgia would probably easily go to Republicans just based on how it's been. But with all this just mixed messaging and like, do we vote? Do we trust the system? Do we not trust the voting machines? It's gonna be strange, man. It's gonna be really strange. So I am really curious to see. And Brian Ritchie, thanks for listening. Good to hear from you. Drew pulled it up there. That is his move-in day. I kind of see Trump after the holidays maybe stepping back, to be completely honest. That's my theory.
Well, we'll have to see. I mean, we'll have to see what he does in his lame. I mean, most of already his lame duck period has been spent fighting the election results. But yeah, I mean, what's the next move for Donald Trump? And what's the next move for the Republican Party? Right, two different things, two different topics, but both important. And we talked a little bit right now about where we think the Republican Party is going, where they should go, and why. And I think the next episode we're going to talk about is more about Trump. What is he going to be doing in his last lame duck session? And what do most presidents do in their last lame duck months, which is give out pardons. So yeah, well, let's. I guess we'll wrap this one up. Is there anything else you wanted to say on this one before we move on?
No, not really. I think it's just going to be a very, very interesting time for the Republican Party. I think it's going to require a lot of soul searching, yes. And Lindsey Graham needs to get the F out. Certain Republicans are just doing disjustice to injustice. Disjustice is a new word I'm coining it. But please check us out. Apple Podcasts, iTunes, YouTube. Still kind of trying to work on Spotify, but it's complicated. And just let us know what you think. Do you disagree? Is the Republican Party better than ever? Is it a shining light on the hill? I don't know. But take care, and we'll talk to you later.